Margaret "Maggie" Thompson wiped down the counter for what felt like the 100th time that morning. The small coffee shop near Norfolk Naval Base buzzed with the usual crowd of sailors, officers, and civilians grabbing their caffeine fix before starting their day. Steam rose from the espresso machine as she worked methodically, her movements practiced and efficient. At 62, she had been running this little establishment for nearly 15 years, serving thousands of cups of coffee to countless faces that came and went with the tides of military assignments. Most customers saw her as just another friendly face behind the counter, perhaps a retired Navy wife or someone who had always lived in this coastal Virginia town. They would order their drinks, exchange pleasantries about the weather or the latest naval exercises they could see from the shore, and continue with their lives. Maggie preferred it that way. She smiled genuinely at each person, remembered their usual orders, and asked about their families. But she never spoke about her own past, never mentioned the decades that came before she started serving coffee. The morning rush was particularly busy that Tuesday in September. A new group of midshipmen from the Naval Academy had arrived for training exercises, their crisp uniforms and eager expressions reminding Maggie of herself decades earlier. She watched them fumble with their orders, trying to impress each other while nervously preparing for their first real taste of fleet operations. Behind them stood seasoned officers, their weathered faces and confident bearing speaking of years at sea and countless missions accomplished. Among the regular customers was Commander Sarah Willis, a helicopter pilot who stopped by every Tuesday and Thursday before her training flights. She always ordered a double-shot Americano, no sugar, and would chat briefly about her upcoming missions. Today she seemed particularly excited, mentioning that a retired admiral would be visiting the base for a ceremony honoring female naval aviators who had broken barriers in the service. Maggie nodded politely, refilling the coffee beans while listening to the conversation. As the morning wore on, Maggie noticed an unusual amount of activity around the base. More cars than usual were streaming through the gates, and she could see dress uniforms among the personnel walking past her shop windows. The ceremony Commander Willis had mentioned was clearly a significant event. Several customers had mentioned it throughout the morning, talking about the distinguished guests who would be attending and the importance of recognizing the women who had paved the way for current female service members. Around 11 o'clock, as the morning rush was winding down, the shop door chimed and a small group of officers entered. They wore their dress blues, ribbons and insignia catching the light from the windows. Among them was an elderly man with silver hair and the bearing that could only come from decades of command. His uniform carried the distinctive shoulder boards of an admiral, and the other officers deferred to him with obvious respect. Maggie glanced up from the cash register where she was counting the morning receipts. The group approached the counter, discussing the upcoming ceremony in low, respectful tones. The Admiral mentioned how important it was to honor the pioneering women who had served when the military was very different than it was today. He spoke about the courage it took to enter male-dominated fields and excel despite facing obstacles that younger generations could hardly imagine. His voice carried the weight of someone who had witnessed history unfold and understood the significance of the changes he had seen. Maggie prepared to take their orders, her usual friendly smile in place. The younger officers ordered first, choosing various specialty drinks from the menu board. When it came to the Admiral's turn, he studied the options carefully before settling on a simple black coffee. As Maggie turned to pour his drink, she moved with the same quiet efficiency she had shown thousands of times before. But something about this moment felt different, though she couldn't quite place why. The Admiral's voice was warm as he thanked her for the coffee, and their eyes met briefly as she handed him the cup. For just an instant, something flickered in his expression, a moment of recognition that seemed to surprise him. But it passed quickly, and he rejoined his group's conversation about the ceremony logistics. Maggie returned to her work, cleaning equipment and restocking supplies, but she found herself glancing occasionally at the group of officers. As they prepared to leave, one of the younger officers mentioned the call signs they had been discussing for the ceremony program. He read from a list, naming the pioneering female aviators who would be honored, including their aircraft assignments and call signs from their active duty years. The names meant little to most people in the shop, but each one represented a woman who had broken new ground in naval aviation when few believed women belonged in cockpits. The Admiral paused at the door, his coffee cup still in his hand. He turned back toward the counter where Maggie was working, his expression thoughtful. For a long moment, he simply watched her as she went about her tasks, wiping down surfaces and organizing supplies with practiced movements. There was something in his gaze that suggested he was remembering something, trying to place a connection that seemed just out of reach. "Excuse me," he said finally, his voice carrying across the now quiet shop. Maggie looked up from the espresso machine she was cleaning, meeting his gaze with polite attention. "I hope you don't mind me asking, but have we met before? There's something familiar." He trailed off, clearly struggling to place where he might have encountered her. Maggie's hand stilled on the cleaning cloth she held. For just a moment, her carefully maintained composure flickered, and something deeper showed in her eyes. But she quickly smiled and shook her head. "I don't think so, Admiral. I meet a lot of people here, but I think I would remember meeting you." Her voice was steady, but those who knew her well might have detected a slight tremor beneath the words. The Admiral nodded slowly, though he didn't look entirely convinced. "My apologies. Sometimes these old memories play tricks on you." He raised his coffee cup in a small salute. "Thank you for the excellent coffee. It's people like you who make this community what it is." With that, he followed his group out of the shop, leaving Maggie alone with her thoughts and the lingering scent of coffee beans. For the rest of the afternoon, Maggie went through her routine with automatic precision, but her mind was elsewhere. She had worked so hard to build this quiet life, to find peace in the simple rhythm of serving coffee and connecting with people in small, meaningful ways. The past she had left behind felt like it belonged to someone else entirely, a different person who had lived a life she rarely allowed herself to remember in detail. The shop grew quiet as the afternoon stretched on. Only a few customers trickled in for afternoon coffee or tea, mostly civilians from the surrounding neighborhood. Maggie used the quiet time to prepare for the next day, checking inventory and cleaning equipment. But her movements lacked their usual focused energy. The brief encounter with the Admiral had stirred something she had worked hard to keep buried, memories of a time when her life had followed a very different path. As evening approached and she prepared to close the shop, Maggie allowed herself to think about the ceremony that was taking place somewhere on the base. She imagined the formal proceedings, the speeches about courage and pioneering spirit, the recognition of women who had served when such service required extraordinary determination. Part of her wondered what it would feel like to be among those being honored, to have her own story told and acknowledged. But that was a life she had chosen to leave behind, and she had made peace with that decision long ago. The last customer of the day was Commander Willis, stopping by after the ceremony for her usual afternoon tea. She was still wearing her dress uniform and seemed energized by the day's events. As Maggie prepared her order, the commander spoke enthusiastically about the ceremony and the remarkable women who had been honored. She mentioned the Admiral who had been the keynote speaker, describing his moving words about the debt the Navy owed to its pioneers. "It's amazing to think about what those women accomplished," Commander Willis said, accepting her tea with a grateful smile. "Flying when most people thought women had no business in military aircraft. Some of them had call signs that became legendary, like Phoenix and Storm and Eagle Eye. The Admiral knew many of them personally from his early career. He told incredible stories about their skill and courage." Maggie's hand trembled almost imperceptibly as she handed over the change. "That sounds like a wonderful ceremony," she said quietly. "It's important to remember the people who came before us." Her voice carried a note of something deeper than casual interest, though Commander Willis was too caught up in her enthusiasm to notice. As the commander left and Maggie locked up for the night, she stood for a moment in the gathering darkness outside her shop. The naval base stretched out beyond the chain-link fence, its lights beginning to twinkle in the twilight. Ships sat at anchor in the distance, their silhouettes familiar and somehow comforting. This had been her world for so long now, this quiet life of service in a different way than she had once known. She had found contentment in it, purpose in the small connections she made each day. But tonight, as she walked to her modest apartment a few blocks away, Maggie couldn't shake the feeling that something was about to change. The Admiral's searching gaze had awakened something she thought she had successfully put to rest. Tomorrow would bring another day of serving coffee, another opportunity to be present for the small moments that made up people's daily lives. Yet she couldn't help but wonder if her carefully constructed new identity was about to be challenged in ways she wasn't prepared for. The next morning brought an unusual chill to the Virginia coast, and Maggie arrived at her coffee shop earlier than usual. She had slept poorly, her dreams filled with fragments of memories she had spent years learning to compartmentalize. The familiar routine of preparing for the day helped center her thoughts, the methodical process of starting machines and arranging supplies providing a welcome distraction from the previous day's encounter. Admiral James Richardson had also spent a restless night. Something about the woman behind the coffee counter had nagged at him, a sense of recognition that he couldn't quite place. He had served for 43 years, meeting thousands of people, working with countless officers and enlisted personnel. Yet there had been something in her eyes, a quality of attention and bearing that seemed familiar in a way that went beyond casual acquaintance. As he prepared for his second day of meetings at Norfolk, the Admiral found himself thinking about the ceremony and the remarkable women they had honored. Many of them had been pioneers in the truest sense, breaking barriers and proving themselves in environments that were often hostile to their presence. He remembered working with some of them during his early career, witnessing firsthand their exceptional skill and unwavering professionalism in the face of skepticism and discrimination. One pilot in particular had made a lasting impression during his time as a young lieutenant commander. She had been assigned to his squadron during a particularly challenging deployment, flying reconnaissance missions that required extraordinary precision and nerves of steel. Her call sign had been Eagle Eye for her uncanny ability to spot targets and navigate in difficult conditions. He had never worked with anyone, male or female, who could read weather patterns and tactical situations with such intuitive accuracy. Admiral Richardson found himself walking back toward the coffee shop, ostensibly to grab another cup of coffee before his meetings but driven by something deeper than caffeine craving. The morning crowd was just beginning to gather, and he recognized several faces from the previous day. The woman behind the counter moved with the same quiet efficiency, greeting customers with genuine warmth while maintaining a professional distance that somehow felt familiar. This time, he studied her more carefully while waiting in line. There was something in the way she held herself, a posture that spoke of discipline and awareness despite her civilian clothing and casual demeanor. When she turned to reach for supplies, he noticed how she moved her shoulders, a subtle gesture that triggered a flash of memory so vivid it stopped him mid-thought. He had seen that exact movement before, in a cockpit, as a pilot reached for controls during a complex landing approach. "Good morning, Admiral," Maggie said as he reached the counter. "Back for more coffee?" Her smile was polite and professional, but he caught something in her expression that hadn't been there the day before. A wariness, perhaps, or a recognition that their previous encounter had left unfinished business between them. "Actually, yes," he replied, studying her face more intently than was probably polite. "I find I'm quite fond of the coffee here. And the service is exceptional." He paused, then decided to take a more direct approach. "I have to ask again, are you sure we haven't met before? There's something about you that's very familiar." Maggie's hand stilled for just a moment as she prepared his order. When she looked up, there was a different quality to her gaze, something that seemed to acknowledge his persistent curiosity while maintaining her careful distance. "I've lived here for 15 years, Admiral. Before that, I lived a very different life. But I'm quite sure our paths never crossed." The Admiral accepted his coffee, but instead of rejoining his colleagues who were waiting near the door, he remained at the counter. 15 years, he repeated thoughtfully. "And before that?" He asked the question gently, but with the persistence of someone accustomed to getting answers to important questions. "Before that, I served," Maggie said simply, her voice carrying a note of finality that suggested the topic was closed. But the Admiral had spent decades reading people, and he recognized the careful phrasing of someone who was telling the truth while revealing as little as possible. "What branch?" he asked quietly, aware that other customers were beginning to notice their extended conversation. Around them, the normal bustle of the morning coffee rush continued, but there was a bubble of intensity around their exchange that seemed to separate them from the ordinary transactions taking place. Maggie met his gaze directly for the first time since he had entered the shop. "Navy," she said, and something in the single word carried the weight of years of service and sacrifice. "But that was a long time ago, Admiral. I'm just someone who serves coffee now." Admiral Richardson felt something click into place, a recognition that went beyond physical appearance to something deeper. "What was your rate?" he pressed gently, using the terminology that would be familiar to any former sailor but foreign to civilians unfamiliar with military structure. "I was a pilot," Maggie replied after a long pause, her voice barely above a whisper. Around them, the coffee shop seemed to fade into background noise as the significance of her admission settled between them. "Naval aviator. But like I said, that was a very long time ago." The Admiral's coffee cup trembled slightly in his hand as pieces of a puzzle began falling into place. "What squadron?" he asked, though he was beginning to suspect he already knew the answer. "What time frame?" Maggie looked around the shop, noting the curious glances from customers who were beginning to pick up on the unusual intensity of their conversation. "Perhaps this isn't the best place for this discussion, Admiral," she suggested, her voice steady despite the obvious emotional weight of the moment. "You're right," he agreed, but he didn't move away from the counter. Instead, he lowered his voice and asked one more question, the answer to which he somehow already knew would change everything. "What was your call sign?" The question hung in the air between them like a challenge. Maggie's composure finally cracked slightly, and for a moment, the careful mask she had worn for 15 years slipped enough to reveal the pilot she had once been. "Eagle Eye," she said softly, the words carrying the weight of a lifetime of memories and achievements she had chosen to set aside. The coffee cup slipped from Admiral Richardson's suddenly nerveless fingers, hitting the counter with a sharp crack that sent hot coffee splashing across the surface. The sound seemed to break whatever spell had held the morning crowd in their routine conversations, and suddenly every eye in the shop was focused on the drama unfolding at the counter. "Lieutenant Margaret Thompson," the Admiral said, his voice carrying a mix of amazement and respect that made several nearby customers straighten unconsciously. "Strike Squadron 87. The pilot who flew reconnaissance over the Persian Gulf when the weather was too dangerous for anyone else to get airborne. The aviator who saved my squadron during the storm of '89 when you guided us home through zero visibility." Maggie's professional facade finally crumbled completely as the weight of recognition and memory crashed over her. The careful distance she had maintained, the quiet anonymity she had cultivated for 15 years, dissolved in the face of this unexpected confrontation with her past. "Admiral," she said quietly, and now her voice carried the unmistakable tone of someone addressing a superior officer despite the civilian clothes and coffee shop setting. "Stand at attention," Admiral Richardson commanded, his voice carrying the authority of decades of command. The order was given quietly, almost conversationally, but every person in the coffee shop recognized the unmistakable tone of military authority. Without conscious thought, Maggie straightened into the posture drilled into her through years of naval training. Her shoulders squared, her spine aligned, her hands positioned precisely at her sides. The transformation was startling, revealing the military bearing that had been hidden beneath 15 years of civilian life. The woman who had been quietly serving coffee was suddenly, unmistakably, a naval officer standing ready for inspection. Admiral Richardson stepped back from the counter and came to attention himself, his own posture reflecting the respect he felt for the pilot who had once served under his command. "Ladies and gentlemen," he announced to the now completely silent coffee shop, his voice carrying easily through the space. "I want you to meet someone very special." The customers and staff throughout the shop had stopped all conversation, instinctively recognizing that they were witnessing something significant. Several of the younger naval personnel had unconsciously straightened their own postures, responding to the Admiral's command presence even without understanding what was happening. "This woman," Admiral Richardson continued, gesturing toward Maggie with obvious pride, "is former Lieutenant Commander Margaret Thompson, naval aviator call sign Eagle Eye. During her career, she flew over 200 combat missions, earned the Distinguished Flying Cross, and saved more lives than I can count. She was one of the finest pilots I ever had the honor to serve with, and one of the pioneers who proved that women belonged in naval aviation. A murmur of amazement rippled through the crowd as people began to understand what they were witnessing. The quiet woman who had been serving their coffee for years was revealed to be a decorated war hero who had chosen anonymity over recognition. Several customers pulled out phones, apparently wanting to capture this moment of unexpected honor. She flew when flying was dangerous, and being a woman made it even more so, the Admiral continued, his voice growing stronger with emotion. She served with distinction during conflicts that shaped the modern Navy, and she did it all while facing obstacles that her male counterparts never had to consider. She is exactly the kind of pilot we honored yesterday, except somehow we missed her. Maggie remained at attention, but tears had begun to stream down her face as 15 years of carefully maintained anonymity crumbled around her. The life she had built serving coffee and connecting with people in small, quiet ways was being transformed by this unexpected recognition of the service she had thought was forgotten. Moreover, Admiral Richardson said, his voice now carrying throughout the entire shop, Lieutenant Commander Thompson saved my life and the lives of 12 other aviators during a storm in 1989. When weather conditions made flying impossible, she volunteered to guide us home through zero visibility conditions that should have killed us all. Her skill and courage brought every one of us back safely. Now the entire coffee shop was standing, customers and staff alike rising to their feet as they began to understand the magnitude of what they were learning. Commander Willis, who had arrived during the Admiral's speech, stood with tears in her own eyes as she recognized the woman who had been serving her coffee as a pioneer who had made her own career possible. "Admiral," Maggie said quietly, her voice shaking with emotion but still carrying the clear tones of an officer addressing a superior. "Permission to speak freely, sir." "Granted," Admiral Richardson replied immediately. "I left that life behind by choice, sir. I found peace in serving in a different way. I'm honored by your words, but I don't need recognition for doing my job." Her voice was steady despite her tears, reflecting the same courage and selflessness that had defined her military service. "No," the Admiral said firmly, "you don't need recognition. But we need to give it. The Navy needs heroes, and the women following in your footsteps need to know about the pilots who came before them. You've been serving coffee in silence, but your service deserves to be remembered and honored." Around them, the coffee shop had become completely still except for the quiet sound of crying from several customers who were moved by the unexpected drama unfolding before them. The morning that had started like any other had become a moment of recognition that none of them would ever forget. Admiral Richardson stepped forward and extended his hand. "Lieutenant Commander Thompson, it has been the greatest honor of my career to serve with you again, even if it's just over coffee." His voice carried the weight of genuine respect and gratitude that transcended rank and protocol. Maggie accepted his handshake, her tears flowing freely now as she allowed herself to reconnect with the pride she had once felt in her service. "The honor has always been mine, Admiral," she replied, her voice strong despite her emotions. The entire coffee shop erupted in spontaneous applause, customers and staff celebrating the unexpected revelation of heroism hidden in their daily routine. In that moment, the quiet woman who had served coffee in silence was finally, properly, recognized for the extraordinary courage and skill that had defined her earlier life. The past she had left behind had found her again, bringing with it the honor and recognition she had never sought but had always deserved.